Good day. Welcome to the Korea Society. Welcome to the Samsung Center, and welcome to Studio Korea. We're delighted to have you here, and we're grateful that you're in this very nice, intimate audience today of some of our regulars. Thank you for those of you who have been with us throughout this series, The Analysts, which has brought to our stage here some of the greatest minds from across the country on Korea. And we've absolutely been delighted with the series, its results, and thank you for your patronage. I'd also like to thank our board member, Lee Snyder, who is here with us today, and she is has lent the wonderful exhibition that you'll see out here afterward, really some fabulous items collected over many years, and a very memorable exhibition at that. And Rudd Potes as well, who is an eminent journalist and was with MacArthur at Incheon and wrote the first great history of the Korean War. So thank you for coming as well, Rudd. Today it is a real pleasure to welcome William Newcomb. Bill is a longtime public servant, career in analysis and intelligence. He has served with Treasury, with the State Department, was a driving force and intellect behind much to do with the Banco Delta Asia, served most recently with the UN experts panel, which makes him really one of the authorities on sanctions and what they have meant. And we'd like to pursue a little bit today kind of his frank assessment of opportunities or limitations associated with that, where we have seen impact, where there has been a need for communications or coordination, what enforcement really means, what do objections from states like China mean in terms of the viability of that when it comes to North Korea. So, Bill, welcome, and congratulations. Delighted to hear that you are a visiting scholar now with the U.S. Korea Institute at Johns Hopkins SAIS. We think very highly of them, and they're really wonderful friends, and delighted that they have found you and you have found them for the stage of your spectacular career. Welcome to the Korea Society.
Well, thank you. This is a big surprise. I've been sitting out there a number of times while I was in New York and never dreaming that I'd be sitting here.
Thanks for being such a great patron. With this great topic, which has been very much a topic in the news, very much a focal point of ways to address North Korea and North Korean behavior. Where do you feel we're at in terms of the issue of sanctions? And if you could perhaps guide us with a case study in terms of some of the things you consider most pertinent.
Well, there's a lot of assessment of sanctions. I think you can pick up just about any journal, any newspaper, and you can read that sanctions are causing all kinds of complications. Sanctions aren't working. We need tougher sanctions. We don't need sanctions. The opinions of people are all over the map. What triggered my decision to suggest this as a topic of conversation is that I get a sense that people who write on sanctions haven't read the sanctions. And so they're foisting a lot of opinions out there without having read and even attempted to disentangle the various types of sanctions out there. And sanctions are quite important, and particularly in the UN context, because they're adopted under Chapter 7, and they're the strongest non-kinetic measure at the UN's disposal to address international peace and security issues. The proper application of sanctions is a work in progress. I think anyone who goes and reads about the experience of countries that have been under sanctions and the shortcomings of the sanctions programs sees where they do have some problem areas. But that's been recognized, and there's been an ongoing process trying to improve sanctions so that, when we think of sanctions, we mostly speak of targeted sanctions, so that they're aimed more at the offenders and there's less collateral damage on the innocent. And in the case of North Korea, the targeted sanctions are actually quite narrow. There are various kinds of activities. There's some bad actors, some entities that engage in proliferation, or the purchase or sale of conventional arms, and that sort of thing. The sanctions on North Korea also have something that's really quite unique, and that's luxury goods. And I think it was quite a surprise when that got added to the original sanctions measure. But the target of that is the elite. And the elite was targeted by the luxury goods ban as, I think, an effort to put pressure indirectly on the leadership to change their behavior. The luxury goods ban hasn't worked very well, and I'll explain why in a second. But the other measures have worked, I think, a bit better, and the financial measures have worked fairly well. That said, anytime a country gets sanctioned, it takes countermeasures because it wants to avoid all these penalties. So if you go back to the case of South Africa when it was sanctioned, you see what they started doing was to do import substitution, to try and develop the critical technologies indigenously that they weren't able to import any longer. And North Korea is no exception. I mean, they have taken a lot of countermeasures so that they can continue to act. These include falsification of the records that are used for containerized shipping. It includes the establishment of front companies and shell companies overseas to act on their behalf. And I've got sort of an example of all of this. So it's a cat and mouse game to make these sanctions effective. Now you have, I'm probably taking a little too long in this introduction, but you got a number of important actors. I mean, in the international context, we have the multilateral sanctions of the UN. You also have autonomous sanctions that the United States, the EU, and other countries, Japan, ROK, have adopted. And so when people write about sanctions, they often confuse. It's very hard to disentangle. And then you have some regulatory authorities that have taken steps that affect North Korea in the financial area, and these are not sanctions. And what I'm referring to here is the Financial Action Task Force. The Financial Action Task Force is the rulemaking body. So if you write a check to pay your London tailor for a tie, it has to go through all kinds of clearances, and the rules under which this check gets cleared are set up by the Financial Action Task Force. And it was originally created back in 1989 as an anti-money laundering measure. After the events of 2001, terrorist finance was added to their mission. And in 2012, proliferation finance was added to their mission. Several years ago, because of anti-money laundering concerns, because North Korea did not have good controls and it was deemed as a threat to the international system in the context of money laundering, it was put on what FATF calls its public list. So when embassies and others complain that it takes a long time for them to get their money from a bank into Pyongyang, for example, to fund operations, and they're blaming sanctions, well, sanctions aren't causing that. What's causing that is that banks are required to do what's called enhanced due diligence. And so each bank in the chain of transaction has to go back and make sure the origin of the money and the destination of the money is legitimate. Most banks don't have to go to that extreme. Their compliance efforts can be satisfied with the assurance of another bank in the chain saying, we already looked at it, it's cool, go ahead. When a bank has to do enhanced due diligence for its compliance, it's expensive. So North Korea is not a profit center for banks, so banks tend to shun DPRK business. So with that, let me just kind of review. I want to speak mostly about the multilateral sanctions. So you have the Security Council, which adopts them. You have the 1718 Committee, which was established by the Security Council to manage them, let's say. You have member states that are required to implement them. And then the panel was established to help the to help the 1718 committee with the management to do investigations of violations, to make recommendations to the committee and to the Security Council on how sanctions might be improved, to, if necessary, recommend other entities for designation because they violated the rules, and so forth. So this is an example of what the panel does, and it also points, I think, to some of the things that work and some of the things that don't work very well. So I guess I go this way. So what I'm going to do is talk a little bit about the Chongchongang. And Chongchongang, that's it right there. It's a North Korean ship seized by Panama. And you can see in the larger picture a caved in 40-foot container. The weight of 250,000 50-kilogram bags of sugar caused a lot of these containers to collapse in on themselves, and they also damaged a lot of vehicles. The crane wasn't working. Panama had to employ a lot of cadets and others to manually unload all the sugar to expose the cargo. And it rained, and literally these poor folks had to do that in the presence of millions of bees. Now, when I was on board the ship, later, after all the cargo had been offloaded and the sugar had been put in a warehouse and stored, there were still a few bees, maybe 10,000, but not millions. And so all of these little things come with their stories. This is the route that the ship took, and this is very typical. They clear the canal, they offload a cargo in Havana. Then all ships are required to carry an automatic identification system. It broadcasts where you are. They turn it off when they exit the canal. And then we know from the ship's records that we were able to, Panamanian authorities collected. So we know that they were drifting there off the coast. And then they go into the port of Mariel, where they load the military cargo, and then they go into Pio Padre, where they pile the sugar on top. And then they came back to the canal, and then they got stopped and searched. So right here, this is false documentation. The one on the top is a loading plan. The one on the bottom is a loading plan. The one on the top doesn't show the military cargo. The one on the bottom does. So they have one to show authorities and one that's real that they can work from. Now, on the right, this is translated. This came from the captain's notebook. This is a really rare thing. That's why I use this, because usually when you do these investigations, you only get a little. Here, we had access to all the ship's records, except for a few that got destroyed. So this is in Korean on the left, as I say, unofficially translated on the right. And you see circled in red some of the air defense systems that were loaded. So this shows that the captain had actual knowledge of the kind of cargo, that it wasn't just black boxes being put in the hold, and he had no clue. And so in this cutaway, you see where the goods were stored, and then sugar was piled on top and between decks and in the top of that. And again, the weight of that caused enormous damage to a lot of this equipment being shipped. And here's an example. And actually, in the left picture at the bottom, that's me. I'm trying to figure something out, but I couldn't resist putting myself in the slide. So you see some of the stuff. All this was taken by the Panamanian authorities and put in a warehouse so that we could conduct a proper investigation of it. And if you put those things together, this is what you have. These are a couple of the air defense systems. They're in use today. They're old Soviet, true, but they're in use today. So it's not like this is a musket rifle or something. And while some of the other pictures you could find in the panel's annual report, this one's not in a report. This is part of the ship stores. It shows WFP maize. that found its way somehow or another. People talk about good controls. There's obviously leakage, and this is an example of some leakage. And I don't know who they bought these for, but we found a lot of extra cargo as well. Is it going to the markets in Pyongyang? Is it going to the foreign ministry so they can have a little party? Did the crew take up a collection so they could sell it and make a little cash on the side? I have no clue, but I was intrigued. I mean, Havana Club, I can understand. Milwaukee's Best was a little bit tougher for me. Now, the North Korean ships often have hidden compartments. I happened to be on the Pongsu, which was seized by Australia, and was involved with the landing of 150 kilograms of heroin. And so while I was on board the Pongsu, we saw that there were a number of hidden compartments there. So when we were on Changchungang, I wanted to look for them as well. The people that had been on board earlier and unloaded the ship and explored the ship had found all of the compartments. And it's not uncommon for ships to have hidden compartments, but the Koreans like to put them behind posters and things like that. So you pull it away from the wall and, you know. So anyway, this is one of them. This is another. You can see this is, instead of being to the side, this is deep. It's a well in access via a ladder. This is the organization surrounding the Changchungang on the cargo side, the Cuban side, and then on the support side. And this shows that the ship, while it claimed to be managed by Changchungang Shipping, records aboard said it was actually managed by Office of Maritime Management. Now, who are they? Well, they manage a lot of ships, but North Korean names are sort of funny. You're your sister's brother. You're your father's son, or perhaps your father's daughter, right? You may be your child's mother or father. So everybody recognizes you and applies a name depending upon the role you're playing. Well, Office of Maritime Management is a name that's used for interaction overseas. Internally, this is the Bureau of Marine Management, and it's a government entity, and it's subordinate to the Bureau of Land and Marine Management. I don't know the full Korean for it, but it's not uncommon at all for North Korean entities to be commercial on the outside and official on the inside. As Steve, I think, knows very, very well. What do I have here? This is payment that was routed to cover some of the costs of the Changchungang, including its canal fee. It wasn't paid by North Korea. This was paid by an outfit called Chinpo Shipping. Now, Chinpo Shipping is located in Singapore. At the time, it was co-located with the North Korean embassy, along with some others. This shows cross-holding directorships. I was talking about fronts and shells and things like that. So here's a good example. It actually is a front because it's operating. It's not just an empty business. And you see the cross-holding directorships in Singapore, particularly with Great Best and Tongye. And Changchungang was not unique. This is a ship that made exactly the same voyage a year before, but the Cubans said the Changchungang was the very first time arms had been loaded. But this had exactly the same sailing pattern, exactly the same offshore position floating outside of Havana and so forth 1 year earlier. Now, this is the consequence of all of that. Now, targeted financial sanctions, to be effective, I mean, for the main, what we're talking about are asset freezes. And to be effective, they should be sudden, so that you don't permit the target to engage in protecting or having the opportunity to move his assets, change his name, or for asset flight. So you want it to be a surprise, you want it to be sudden, and capture as much as you can, because the whole idea is to deprive the entity of the ability to use these funds. The incident of the Changchungang took place in the summer of 2013. Office of Maritime Management was not sanctioned by the 1718 committee until this summer. It took a whole year, even though the investigation was concluded in half that time. So there was a lot of foot dragging before this happened. And the foot dragging is because designations are not simply because someone did something wrong. Designations are political. If you look at the number of designated individuals and entities in the case of Iran, it far exceeds the 12 individuals and 20 entities that have been designated by the United Nations in the DPRK. I assure you, there are a lot more candidates worthy of designation doing bad things in North Korea than have been designated. You can go to the EU designation list, and you would see firms identified as being subordinate to or superior to designated firms, which makes them designatable, but they haven't been designated by the UN. In this particular case, OFAC, and there's one other thing. If you look at the coordinates of OML, you see they're very restricted. It just gives a Pyongyang address. If you look at what OFAC did, they designated Office of Maritime Management. They also designated Changchungang Shipping, which was equally culpable in this particular event. And if you look at the addresses, OFAC provides a lot more coordinates than the UN did, because OML maintained a global footprint. If you're going to ask countries to enforce sanctions, you need to give them the best information possible. And in this case, information was withheld in the UN resolution, but you have to turn to other sources of information in order to do that. And the other advantage of naming, I apologize for the tiny type. These are ships that appeared on OFAC's SDN list. And they are all operated and managed by Office of Maritime Management, and that's why those ships fall under that. And it complicates their particular lives. Now that's it. I took much too much time with this example, but I think it illustrates sanctions. We have, in effect, 3 Chapter 7 resolutions, 1718, 1874, and 2094. 2094 was adopted just in 2013. And if you examine them, you'll see that there is a trajectory. And that means the sanctions are getting tougher, they're getting broader, and loopholes are being closed. The fact that they're adopted means that there is consensus on the part of the Security Council that this can be done. There are, in effect, 30 countries have served on the Security Council during this time. Right, so that's a pretty good consensus, and that's a good representation of countries moving up to the Security Council to do their 2-year stint. So there is this agreement. At the same time, the 1718 committee, which is supposed to be managing and implementing this, has been less aggressive than the Security Council resolutions would have permitted it to be. And that's because politics complicates everything. Let me stop there.
Okay, let's go to a question that I know on a lot of the audience members' minds in terms of the politics, in particular of China, and where China has stood in terms of veto, where China may be shifting or being perhaps more lenient as time goes forward. How do you read China's role in this and the politics of that?
Wow, it's really mixed. Mm-hmm. I think China's reassessing everything. I don't think they're big fans of sanctions. They're certainly not fans, a number of member states are not fans of countries adopting autonomous sanctions. They think if sanctions are adopted, they ought to be restricted to multilateral. The luxury goods sanction, the measure, depends upon member states to each define what they mean by a luxury good. China never really published a long list of luxury goods. That makes it very difficult. Other places, the first to adopt a list of luxury goods was Switzerland. And then they communicated their list to the EU when the EU was scratching their head about, well, what's a luxury good and how should we define it? The interesting thing is, and this shows you how things can be different, the EU, when it's looking at watches as a luxury goods, defines a luxury watch as anything over 100 euro. The Swiss define a luxury watch as anything over 1,000 euro. The Swiss presume they know a luxury watch when they see one, right? So in the case of China, we just don't have that. So what you find is that a lot of European luxury goods are going to distributors in China and winding up in North Korea. You go to the airport in Beijing and you'll see in the cargo a lot of flat screen TVs that are moving into North Korea, either for individuals or for the market. But it's not because Europeans are violating the sanctions. It's because the luxury goods sanction hasn't been properly defined and implemented in China, and it's up to China to do so. I think China does a better job when it comes to proliferation goods. I think that they have toughened up. Anecdotally, you hear that. The evidence is a bit lacking. There has never been a shipment from North Korea that the committee has been notified was inspected by China. There have been shipments that have moved through Chinese ports that have been inspected in other ports and found to contain prohibited cargo. Right? There has never been one declared inspection in a Chinese port. And I think China's remiss by not doing that. It is possible they have stopped shipments and just kept quiet about it. But that's against the resolutions. If you do an inspection, all countries are required to report to the committee they've done so. So I see China as very mixed. North Korea does a lot of business with China. Security Council resolutions do not prohibit normal economic exchange. If you're trading with somebody, money's going to go back and forth. There's some RMB clearing that takes place as well. So the fact that you see this doesn't mean China's doing anything wrong. They have this huge coal trade. They do iron ore. They've got investments across the border. They do textiles. There's fishery products. There's food that goes both ways. So all of this is kind of normal and natural and not an indication that sanctions are being violated. But the record could be a lot better. And China has been, it is suspicious of sanctions. It's not interested in adding to the list of designated entities.
I guess I'd ask you, by way of follow-on, about Chinese banks and some of the tightening, as well as perhaps a look back, given your experience with Banco Delta Asia. Here in the context of our human rights discussions in the Analysts series, there was a reference to North Korea's concern now over possible referral to the ICC, and one of our guests said, well, the last time I saw this sort of reaction was Banco Delta Asia. And so looking back at it, given your intense involvement in that, how did that process sort of work in a few words in terms of your evaluation, and what do you think about its efficacy as we go forward?
Yeah. At the time, I thought it worked really well. It didn't come out of the blue. Several years of deep research preceded this. We examined North Korea's international financial network, and several nodes popped up. Now, some of the nodes were just simple commercial nodes. Others were nodes for collecting receipts for military sales, which at the time were not prohibited. I mean, they were perfectly free before the resolutions to sell their missiles and tanks or whatever wherever they could, and they were a cheap source of conventional military weapons. And then there was this bank in Macau where we saw a node that included a lot of illicit activity. And so that suggested to us that this would be an appropriate place to go in and
this was 2005.
Well,
it was a little earlier.
It was waiting in the wings for a while. There were some other things going on at the time that delayed the publication of the Notice of Proposed Rulemaking in the Federal Register. And the things that we were waiting on, they were called Smoking Dragon and Royal Charm, which were the coordinated law enforcement busts of counterfeiting, narco-trafficking, cigarette smuggling on the West Coast and the East Coast. And that had been going on for a long time. And the fear was that if we triggered Banco Delta Asia, the persons that they were trying to get into the U.S., into U.S. jurisdictions so that they could be arrested and tried, would not come. So it became sequenced to that. Unfortunately, after that broke and we did do it, it was right on the heels of the Berlin talks. So the timing could have been a lot better, but everything got into sort of a train. There's a really good discussion of all of these authorities. A friend of mine named Juan Zarate wrote a book called Treasury's Work. So I'll plug it right now. And it talks all about the development of financial authorities as a strategic tool for the United States.
Great.
So can Banco Delta Asia be repeated? Not the same way. There's no central node, and North Korea has been pushed out of a lot of the banking structures. And that's why it's adopted, and we knew it would, but it's why it's taken the countermeasures of working through fronts like Chinpo shipping.
And the Chinese bank tightenings.
Chinese bank tightenings are not so much a result of the financial sanctions. They're more a result of working with Treasury, particularly in terms of the Foreign Trade Bank. Treasury designated the put it on its SDN list, especially designated nationals. And then it talked to the Chinese authorities, and China then took steps to bar Chinese banks from working with Foreign Trade Bank, because Foreign Trade Bank was clearing the transactions of the big military companies in North Korea. So that's why it got on the list.
Good.
So can we find another BDA out there? No. There are other things you can do that are similar, but I don't think there's another BDA candidate that rises above the risk. And banks are being much more careful.
Thank you very much, Bill Newcomb. And please, round of applause. You've talked a lot, not only about the complexity of sanctions and ways we might want to think more richly about it, but also a lot about trade and aid and development. So thank you for taking that. I would like to encourage our audience to return next week for the conclusion of the series, The Analysts, which will feature John Park from Harvard University talking about China-North Korea relations. So we'll certainly revisit some of the questions that were asked here today. And I would also like to mention that on Monday night, we have Dan Snyder, who happens to be Lee's son. He is the Associate Director of the Stanford Shorenstein Center for Asia-Pacific Research, and has done very notable work there on issues of nationalism and regionalism and identity. He, besides doing very good academic work at Stanford, was a very noted journalist, and so we're delighted to have him in. He will be talking about the Snyder family legacy, their love for and devotion to Korea, and their family's service there. And so we look forward to welcoming you all back Monday night at 6, if possible, and then next Friday at noon. And Bill Newcomb, thank you for coming up. I would encourage all of you to take a look at two of the things that Bill is affiliated with. One I mentioned, which is the U.S. Korea Institute at Johns Hopkins SAIS, which does a tremendous amount of work. Some of you may know their website, 38 North, which does a lot of satellite imagery. But that institute is expanding and doing some very nice work in our area. And I'd also recommend the National Committee on North Korea, NCNK, of which Bill is a member, and their new president, or its new president, Keith Luce, is really moving forward very interestingly with the expansion of the National Committee on North Korea. So you might want to visit both of their websites, as well as the Korea Society for membership and more information. Please do have a look at our exhibition on the way out, and we'd like to give you an opportunity to meet Bill Newcomb if you're keen before leaving, and thank you for your support of the Korea Society and your attendance and great questions today. Have a wonderful afternoon. Bill Newcomb, thank you.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you very much.